All right. That's it for technical housekeeping. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana Sargent, and I'm the Executive Director of Cape Fear River Watch. And as always, I am your host for our first Saturday seminar. It is amazing to see so many of you here. I want to start by first recognizing our board members who are present. As always, our wonderful board shows up to our events and keeps on top of all the issues we're working on. And I could not be more honored to work with these folks. So if you could just say hi after I say your name so people can see you, that would be great. Start with our board president, Bill Rainey. He didn't say hi, he waved hi. Vice President Paul Smith, I believe you are on here. I can't see because we've got 4 pages. Feel free to say hi. Our treasurer, Dick Brightman.
Good morning, all.
Good morning, Dick. Our secretary, Paige Patterson, is on.
Hello.
Good morning, Paige. Shantae Allen.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning, Shantae. Sandra Bergman.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Sandra. Gordon. Gordon is on. I don't know if Gordon has audio. Maybe not. Who else? Miss Deborah Dix Maxwell. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And Jeannie Lennon.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning, Jeannie. And Larry Cahoon.
Good morning, folks.
Good morning, Larry. Have I missed any board members that are present? Okay, I'm so grateful for you all to be here. It's wonderful to see you all. So since this event got a lot of interest, and some of you may be from out of state or potentially out of country, or those of you who may not have had access to information about this crisis, I want to share just the briefest of summaries with you. So we woke up to the news in June of 2017 that our Cape Fear River, the drinking water supply for nearly 300,000 people in an ecologically diverse hotspot, had been contaminated by a chemical that was being called GenX. And then we learned that GenX was just a tiny fraction of the contamination, and that it had been ongoing for 40 years, first by DuPont and then Chemours. And I want to stop here and say that just thinking back to where we were in 2017, at the feelings in the room at the events we held back then, the sense of fear and confusion and helplessness, if you felt it like I did, it was palpable. So, I want to say these events can be sort of just overbearing on your soul, but we have come really far in these past 4 years. And that is because of you, our community, because of the tireless efforts from our esteemed speakers that we'll see in a few moments, and others like them across the state and country, including some of the folks that are on this call, and many of our guests on this meeting working every day to find out more and affect change. And especially because of the voices of the public. Your voices have fueled any successes we've had. But again, while we've come really far, we have obviously much farther to go. Cape Fear River Watch got to work in 2017, seeking information and sharing it as best we could. And then for me, it got really personal. In the fall of that same year, my brother Grant, a former US Marine and career firefighter in the city of Chicago, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. He was given 1 month to 5 years to live, and he died in December of 2019 at the age of 47. He was a hero to everyone who knew him and to countless strangers. And I am insanely grateful for the opportunities that my work provides me in finding out more about PFAS exposure in our firefighters and military communities and doing what I can to stop it. As most of you know, we sued Chemours for their actions, as well as our State Department of Environmental Quality for their inaction. The result of which was a consent order signed by all 3 parties in February of 2019 and giving Cape Fear River Watch oversight of its requirements. It is a strong order forcing the company to take urgent steps to stop the discharge and clean up their mess. A quick update of the progress so far: a thermal oxidizer was installed December 2020, and it is stopping PFAS air emissions by more than 99.99%. In addition, we have made significant progress through the installation of a capture and filtration system last fall at an old outfall that had become essentially a creek of highly contaminated groundwater flowing into the river. The contamination from these seeps, they call them, had been ongoing even after the company stopped the wastewater discharge back in 2017, and the PFAS load was extremely high. Our most recent data from just last week shows all of our indicator PFAS at near non-detect levels, meaning the scientists, you can't even really see that they're there. And we look forward to watching the river levels downstream become affected by this effort. Chemours is required to continue to sample personal wells around the facility. And at this point, there's about 4,800 personal wells. It's a devastating number with contamination levels that force Chemours to provide them drinking water alternatives. They will continue to sample these wells outward from the facility until they don't find any more PFAS. There is so much more involved in that order, including health studies and ongoing data collection and soil remediation, and I can go on and on. And with enormous support from the Southern Environmental Law Center and their team of experts, together we are holding Chemours accountable for the order's requirements. Aside from that, Cape Fear River Watch is involved in a range of PFAS work, from supporting academia on research projects to legislative and regulatory work to outreach and education, and through service by both myself and Kemp. And I just remembered I forgot to introduce Kemp Burdett, our Riverkeeper, is on the call, on numerous boards and committees working on PFAS, and through legal avenues, including a Toxic Substances Control Act challenge, and as a party to a petition to the EPA that would require Chemours pay for health studies on 54 PFAS, which you'll hear more about today. So here's the inevitable plug. Keep up with our work, go to capefearriverwatch.org and sign up to receive our weekly e-newsletter. So I know that was a lot, and it was fast, but I feel like I just needed to give you all a little summary before we get going. And in the interest of time, we shared the bios of our amazing speakers separately all week on social media and included them on our website. And I hope you had a chance to look at them. If not, I am going to add a link to their bios into the chat just as soon as I get done speaking. So you can feel free to take a look at that. And you will certainly get an idea of how amazing these folks are once they start speaking. So with that, I am going to go ahead and push this over to Micia Whittington and to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. Good morning, everyone. Definitely it's a pleasure and an honor to be in space with you all, and thank you for just inviting us and inviting me, Dana, but also just for welcoming me here. My name is Micia Whittington. The community calls me LA. I'm originally from the mountains, and so that's my background. Even though I'm located in Holly Springs, Fuquay, Varina now, I'm from the Blue Ridge, so I gotta represent home, y'all. And so just a little bit of myself. Just a little bit about myself. Again, I'm from the mountains. I come from a long line of agriculture folks who lived off the land, long line of farmers. And of course, our community is rural, just like many communities across North Carolina, because the Triangle is not representative of North Carolina, y'all, and we know this with folks on the call. And so our community went from farming to textile and manufacturing and corporations. And so, for example, we had Haynes, we had, furniture corporations, and my great uncle actually worked for DuPont and retired from DuPont when he served after he came back from the Vietnam War. And so that was a part of our tapestry of where I'm from. And so just to be in this place, it's a personal fight just because my great uncle actually worked for DuPont, not knowing the impact that it had on the West, but also our community and family members that are in areas like South Kinston, who also live in proximity to DuPont, and it was considered a Superfund site, and just what has been the impact on that community. So that's more of a personal note of who I am and why and who I bring into space. But also just a little bit of a background personally, we, as Dana already said, we became aware in 2017, but in 2018, Hurricane Florence hit. And so why that's really important is because this has been kind of the cycle of North Carolina. If folks are, I know there's some people I think that may be outside of North Carolina, but for us, we have a lot of hurricanes, y'all. And so when DuPont purchased from 3M, the corporation, this was 1980, well, Hurricane Diana and Hurricane Fran hit 1984. So we're talking about breaches and groundwater contamination. Think about the hurricanes and how many have happened over the cycle of this 40 years. that has actually poured these chemicals and spread them a lot further in our communities. And so we're talking about just that proximity and mileage and disparate impact. But the same thing happened, of course, of Hurricane Florence. And so even though it was reported that there was, corporate contamination from coal ash or, corporate farming, apparatuses, they didn't talk about PFAS being in the water. And so that's a problem. And so I've been really honored to join in our organizations as co-petitioners alongside Dana and the great folks, alongside Emily and other folks on this call that you'll hear from and have heard from before. And so we're not only co-petitioners, we're also currently working with as volunteers with the National Academies of Sciences. And so you'll see my presentation here and just kind of the impacts that I'll elevate that a lot of Black and brown and low wealth populations are dealing with, but it hits all of us. And it's cumulative impact. And so to give a little bit more about what's happening with the National Academies of Sciences, so you'll see the presentation is something that I also gave to that academy to talk about how our communities need to also be tested. In addition to water and drinking water, it also need to be in our food and our infrastructures and our materials and workers support and workers' right insurance coverage. You'll see that in a minute. But the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has sponsored a study. And so this study will provide advice for clinicians about PFAS testing and how test results should inform clinical care. And so additionally, the same committee will examine the health outcomes associated with PFAS exposure and will develop principles that clinicians, doctors can use to advise patients on exposure reduction. So we know a lot of our doctors aren't familiar with PFAS and definitely not familiar with how to treat it. And so this is hopefully a step in the right direction so that doctors will know how to treat it, where to get it tested, how to diagnose it, what does it mean to help folks with their insurance coverage and the like. And so I'll go on and start my presentation. All right, if you can't see my screen, let me know and I'll stop and back up. But PFAS, a community crisis, and this is a hyper-local lens on the community. The outline of where we're about to go. Just the introduction, I've already kind of given that of myself. Just the impact on BIPOC, as we call it, Black, brown, people of color communities, but also low wealth populations, so rural areas with food deserts, medical deserts, and the like. What the potential health effects are, which many of us are already well aware, but it's good to ground it in space. And what is the value in testing our people in addition to testing the water? Why do we need to be tested, right? And then the last is the call to action. So this is what we're really asking for to be added in these clinical guidelines. And this is a part of the call to action that everyone on this call can be involved in and give a public comment to National Academies of Sciences so they hear all of us. Again, my name is Micia Whittington. I'm a professor at Meredith College and a co-lecturer, guest lecturer at NC State, often in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department. And this is where I'm from, in Blue Ridge. Okay, so let's just go and get started. So for North Carolina, we have over 35% of all of us in North Carolina are renters. And so when we talk about our neighbors, our family, our friends, we have to talk about the areas of exposure to PFAS, right? Areas of exposure, housing is one of the highest for us. This starts with the cumulative impact that I was talking about. The largest exposure for PFAS is our carpet for our children. And so that's because of stain repellent. And when we're talking about affordable housing and low wealth populations, we are oftentimes talking to, our local elected officials, our state elected officials about economic development. Well, what about when we finally achieve affordable housing or we finally achieve housing that is inclusive of rural communities, and then inside that housing is carpet and other furnishings that is coated with PFAS? We're trying to make sure we want to do lift this analysis that we need to protect our folks, not only getting affordable housing, but also being able to have healthy housing, right? So this is a large source for us. Another large source is, of course, food deserts. We have 100 counties in North Carolina. 80 out of those 100 are considered food deserts or contained food deserts. So most of our people in rural communities are 10 miles away from grocery stores, and in urban areas, 1 mile away from grocery stores. That creates a larger issue, and we're about to see why. But I wanted to ground here this map because the deeper shades of green not only shows food deserts, but also shows where the highest population of our people are without transportation. So no vehicle, and in a food desert, that limits your access to these healthy foods, your fruits, your veggies, and the like, access, and foods that you may need to purchase in order to support if you have been diagnosed with cancers, or you're dealing with asthma, or you're dealing with lung lung and bronchial issues, this makes it harder to get the dietary needs that you need. This is one of the reasons, in addition to the impact of being far away from grocery stores and access to healthy food, the other impact is the fact that PFAS is very much in the containers and fast food restaurants. So a lot of our communities that are food deserts, where's the access for a family meal? Oftentimes that's fast food. It's quick, it's convenient, and it's not a grocery store that's 10 plus miles away from the home. So you pick it up on your way home, or you go out and you pick up a fast food meal. That's pretty common in communities, right? Or we have folks who work in these franchises. So we have close to 500,000 of all North Carolina residents are food service employees or workers, right? So then you're exposed to the food at work, and you're also eating on your lunch break, or if you're working at surrounding corporations or surrounding jobs, you may stop at your local Burger King, your local McDonald's and the like for just a quick meal. Well, this is an easy access or easy pathway to PFAS. And so we saw that there's been different studies that have been done on the wrappers, but your dessert and bread wrappers are 56% of the contamination, burger and sandwich wrappers, 38%, paperboard 20%, and interesting enough, paper cups is 0. So you're looking at your main food, right? The wrappers and the containers that have been sitting in the back not only has seeped into the food, but now the actual wrappers that contain your food that you hold in hand is contaminated with PFAS. And so we've heard about, McDonald's, promising to continue the use of PFAS in 9 years. I believe Wendy's is the most current one that's talking about discontinuing the use of PFAS a lot sooner. So that's good, and momentum is happening, but we still need to stay on top of these corporations because that's cumulative impact on food desert and rural communities, because this is where we eat and this is where we live. What's the support? And especially when you have expectant mothers that are working in these fast food restaurants and they're eating those meals, that's exposing, of course, their embryo, their child to this PFAS that could cross over the placenta. So that's the other impact. And in our communities, unfortunately, it is a very common occurrence for our women that are working in these restaurants to actually miscarriage pretty often. And what is the testing that we need to see if PFAS and them eating the meal regularly on break is correlated, and if that's the cause for their miscarriages? So in addition to food deserts, in addition to what's in the actual food, right? In addition to being renters and being exposed through carpet and other stain repellent furnishings, it could be on your mattress, it could be on your non-stick Teflon pans, throw those out, y'all. Use your cast iron skillets. It's in your microwavable bags and the lining of the wax, in addition to being in your home, right? In addition to being food deserts, we're also looking at cumulative impact with if you are working and living in proximity to the plant, right? So not only if you're working at Fayetteville Works or you're working in another DuPont subsidiary, wonder if across the street, it's a Smithfield subsidiary. What does that mean? It means that the food that the pork, the water that the pork is sitting in may be contaminated with PFAS. It means that the packaging that the pork or the animal product is being packaged in probably has PFAS. So then you're shipping, right? The person who's working is already having to deal and mess with that water. They're having to be exposed and breathing in while they're on the job. But then if this product gets shipped out to the state, to the community, to the nation and global, then everybody is receiving an animal byproduct that has now been soaked and saturated in PFAS. That's cumulative impact. That's why we have to look at what water, how are we testing, how are we looking at these different corporations that are in proximity to each other, and how are we protecting fast food, plant workers, and corporation workers. One of the examples is we need OSHA studies on fast food employees. We need to know. We need to know what is the impact on our people that are working in these plants. And so that's one of the things, right? And so long-term impacts on health, air emissions, and cumulative impact when these industries collide. And again, we need to test exposure and make provisions for those closer in proximity and more consistently exposed to this emerging contaminant. So how are communities tested that are further away from this plant versus how much more do we need to test, support, and make provisions for people who are living closer to these plants and working in them at the same time. Some high priority populations for our folks, but for everybody, like I said before, is expectant mothers. PFAS is, many folks on here are aware, but for folks tuning in that are new to the space, PFAS can cross over the placenta. PFAS can be passed to the infant through breastfeeding, and the need for blood testing in PFAS contaminated zones. And I see, If fast food workers wear gloves, would that protect them? Rebecca, that's an excellent question. And so when you're talking about, and I'll deviate real quick and then come right back. When you're talking about eating food, right? So if you're eating on your break, that's consumption of the PFAS saturated food. And so that's a problem. That's one of the major problems and why we elevate like the food desert is the consumption. But it's an excellent question about the gloves and would that actually protect? I think that's a wonderful question. But then the second is, can we make sure that even the products that are provided, because there are gloves on site sometimes at fast food restaurants, have they been in proximity to the same containers and contaminants that the food has been exposed to? But really excellent question and appreciate that. And so back to expectant mothers, right? Followed by the need for adequate medical care for expected parent and child. So how are we informing or supporting the information getting to our doctors when our mothers are going for their prenatal visits? How about actually being with that mother after birth? Because again, breastfeeding. So how is that baby adapting to life? Like, what's going on with them medically? Are we actually tracking the lifespan of that child and mother and seeing exactly what needs to be there in terms of resources, care, and support? The other thing is returning citizens. So we have a great amount of confinement facilities, nursing home facilities, and the like. Over 2,000 folks are actually in confinement facilities downstream of the Cape Fear, the Neuse River. So when we're talking about returning citizens, there were 35,000 plus people in North Carolina prisons and over across the state. We need blood testing for individuals in custody of law enforcement. So how are they being exposed to the same water inside these confinement facilities? And when they come back home, when they're returning, what does it mean for them and their community if they have been impacted by PFAS while being in that confinement facility? And so how are we looking at these special populations? And what is the clinical guidelines for free clinics and urgent cares so that we know that not only returning citizens, but folks in medical deserts, right, don't oftentimes have health insurance or it's really expensive to afford it. So our people are going to urgent cares, they're going to free clinics. So what is available as clinical guidelines or what needs to be available so that when they access this free clinic, their doctors are already aware, their clinicians are already supported with the information to say, well, you're in a PFAS impacted area. Let's see let's get you tested. Let's see if that's what the issue is. And so also outreach to these returning citizens. Another is communities living with disabilities. And so when we're talking about North Carolina, communities living with disabilities comprises 18% of the total extremely low income in our state, 18%. And so we need to be really clear how our communities having access to water stations when that's made available. How are they being included in the same testing studies to make sure that they're supported? And what does it mean to be accessible with this kind of testing for communities living with disabilities? And especially when we're talking about carpet and manufactured materials, how do we elevate? Is their home, are their apartments, their home, house, has it been secured? Is it clean, sustainable, and healthy? And Dana, please let me know when I'm getting near my time because I don't want to go over, please. And so the other priority areas and, just standing in solidarity with Dana and just have appreciated her leadership and just deep love for her as a colleague, as a friend. One of the areas that we also look at is firefighters. So we have a coalition of Black firefighters called the Omnibus Firefighters that are based in Winston-Salem, but have connections and of course fellow firefighters across the state, across the nation, but we need them to be tested as well in terms of blood testing and exposure to not only their foam, AFFF, that they use to put out fires with certain fires, but also their gear and what has that meant long-term. And also to test folks who have their hazmat certification because folks can carry AFFF up to 50 buckets on one hazmat truck, y'all. So how are they being exposed? And what does it mean to track that and to support our frontline essential workers who are laying their lives on the line to protect us? We need to protect them. The last two I already mentioned, living and care facilities and alternative housing. And so there are 27 senior living care facilities that houses over 2,000 residents downstream of the Cape Fear River. How are we testing these senior living care facilities and the water that is being given to our elders? And how are we testing to make sure that the packaging that their food is being delivered in, what does that look like? And how are they doing? Testing should include this population and clinical guidelines should be given on the front end to social security services, to DHS, DHHS, and such places like disability rights. These are also the same corporations that are supporting, or nonprofit orgs that are supporting these communities. They need to be equipped with these clinical guidelines too, to make sure their folks are safe and secure and protected, or at least tested. And how can we get our folks safe, secure, and protected? The other thing with that population is the heightened concern with water quality, manufactured materials, and air emissions. And so accessible testing for family dwellings, especially in alternative housing, because a lot of folks live in hotels, y'all, in North Carolina, extended stays, shelters. How are we supporting folks who are living in hotels because of just low wealth, and some folks who do actually work really hard and make, you know, enough to actually pay for a mortgage sometimes can't, you know, they're not able to get mortgages for many different reasons. But how about our folks who live in hotels, and how are we tracking the impact in those populations? The last high priority population, and these aren't the only, but these are to elevate the intersection of so many of our folks and where they're living and where it could be cross-contamination, what that looks like, our students. So for us, we have, you know, we have community college, we have historically Black colleges and universities, we have predominantly minority institutions, and of course, PWIs as well. So your state land grants, your predominantly white institutions, all those colleges, how are our students being impacted? Has the water been tested? Have they been tested? No. So that's a part of it. We need to support our college students. We need to actually look at the infrastructure of the university itself. When we think about like Fayetteville State University and Methodist University, that's in proximity to this plant. How are they being supported, tested, and even informed and educated and made aware? And of course, we know there are 161 K through 12 schools located across Cumberland, Bladen, Brunswick, and New Hanover. And so how are we making sure, and have appreciated the leadership again of Cape Fear River Watch and the consent order, so that we could actually push the pendulum forward to having our schools tested? And how are we going to continue this momentum to test the other schools in this area, right? And so these are some of our high priority populations. So I'm winding down and coming to a close now. Let me make sure. Oh, thanks, Emily. Okay, that's great. Is there a list of building materials I can take PFAS? Thank you, Emily. And tuning Lake Key post site. Okay, great. And so as I wind down, okay, here is rural and urban. We are very connected. My elevation is rural. Like I said, you know, there are more rural communities in North Carolina than not. I'm a rural woman, but we have a lot of similarities, right? So medical deserts means lack of diverse healthcare options. A lot of us, like even where I live, we have to go 25, 30 minutes to reach the nearest hospital. Okay, that's normal for rural communities. You can go 20 miles plus for a hospital. Okay, what are your options? Sometimes it's the urgent care. So we have to be aware of that when we're testing these populations, and our agencies need to be made aware of where all we live, not just focus on urban areas. They need that, but rural as well, and how they're being accessible. Communities are on unregulated utilities and in unincorporated towns. So when we're talking about folks who are on regulated utilities, on public utilities, they're, you know, they are oftentimes a policy seen and included first, and that's good, but we need to make sure we're adding wells. We need to make sure we're adding people who are on unregulated utilities and unincorporated towns. North Carolina, we have towns that are not in the city limits. We have towns that are unincorporated. They need to be included in these testing, studies, not excluded. And then of course, the impact on our property and our family land and our wildlife, because if the land's sick, we're sick. If we're sick, is a pretty good indication that the land is sick. It's all one same cycle, because we are one with the land and we are stewards of this earth. So the last thing is lack of insurance coverage is similar to rural communities, already touched on that, and lack of clinical guidelines of PFAS for free clinics and urgent cares. We have to make sure that when we're supporting and giving public comment to places like the National Academies of Science, we need to include where our rural communities go for medical health care, and that's where we need to support the most. We need to talk about double exposure to air emissions and public utilities and food, and being exposed to multiple corporations that have that cumulative impact, right? Close to industrial. And of course, like I said, increased exposure to fast food and impact on urban fishing. A lot of our communities, BIPOC communities, we fish. And in urban areas, we'll still go urban fishing, even if we're not in rural areas. We got to look at how our biodiversity and fish is impacted. Now I'm at my end. This is a page that Dana and folks will be able to share out with everyone here. And this is the actual like bullet point list of what we have recommended, what I've recommended to National Academy of Science, but what also we're asking folks to recommend as well, and to just include so that we're supporting rural and urban communities, and we're including folks that are, you know, access to food deserts, medical deserts, and their employees and workers, and also farm workers that are exposed to air emissions. We need to support all our people. And so this is just a list of what we're asking for. It can be expanded. Please don't think this is exhaustive, but I hope this helps. And so, you know, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, like Micia Whittington or LA. And again, an honor to really be here. And if there are questions, I can definitely answer them when the time has come. And Dana, I appreciate you again. Kemp and the board, I appreciate y'all as well. And so at this time, I'll pass it over to my good friend, Emily.
Tough act to follow. Thank you, LA. Okay, so let me get, first of all, thank you, everyone. It's pretty awesome to be here. This is really great turnout, and I'm grateful to be a part of this moment. All right, so Clean Cape Fear's leadership team is still me, Jessica, John C., Drake, Rebecca Trammell is on the call. Hey, Rebecca, and Harper Peterson. Just for those that need a quick refresher, we formed in 2017. We are 100% grassroots, concerned residents trying to take action. We had a lot of, you know, our founding members were Cape Fear River Watch as well. We work closely with Cape Fear River Watch. We are not a nonprofit, so we don't fundraise. But if we do fundraise, it's always to tell people to send money to Cape Fear River Watch. We fully 100% support everything that that this amazing organization is doing. And we just try to stand in the gap where possible and really hyper focus in on PFAS, because there is a lot that I know Cape Fear River Watch is having to take care of from multiple fronts. We also work on building public awareness. That was really apparent early on, that one of the biggest concerns was lack of information or access to information. So we made sure that we could be that that megaphone for the scientific community to really get the information that was relevant to our community out there. And then also in intentionally not staying a nonprofit, we're here for accountability measures. We feel like the industry has done a fantastic job of capturing our agencies, capturing certain politicians, capturing organizations. And so by staying completely free of that, we were kind of maintaining that public trust or rebuilding public trust by not being influenced by any sort of funding in any way. Not saying that that happens with the organizations that we partner with, but we know that it has happened with other organizations just through history and learning about DuPont. So everybody knows the map, so I won't take too long on this, but just wanted to remind everybody, the contamination scope, 5 counties, 300,000 municipal ratepayers, well over 4,000 and counting private well owners near the Chemours facility. We also have to remember Pittsburgh, and I know Emily Sutton's gonna probably focus on this and can really go into that later. But you know, this is the river system for Cape Fear. You guys know this better than I do. It feeds 100 million. Well, it feeds, but you know, it services over 1 million North Carolinians with a source of drinking water. So where are we seeing progress and problems with drinking water? I guess we can look at one of the positives is that we know a lot more now than we did 4 years ago, and that is a positive because the more you know, the more knowledge is power. And it's important when you're advocating to really be able to figure that out. That the consent order has been a really positive thing for us in the fact that when I say us, I mean us, the community global. This was really lion's share work of Cape Fear River Watch, but we now know that 300 newly identified chemicals were coming from Chemours. Just in the last year alone, our local utilities have doubled the amount of PFAS that they're testing for. And another positive is that the PFAS network is doing a total fluorine analysis. And part of that is, you know, the whole iceberg analogy, we've seen this for so many years, is that what we see up top is what we know about, but what about all the stuff we don't know about? And that is the reality. And again, that's the problem, is that the EPA's database was updated recently and they've cataloged over 9,000 PFAS in their database. But again, our utilities are only sampling for maybe a little over 50 PFAS. So what are some of the problems that we're still seeing right now? We are seeing that utilities can't test for everything. And so that's really important when I brought up that the PFAS network is looking at a total fluorine analysis, is that maybe this is the direction we need to go in so we can see the full scope of contamination. Utilities are doing voluntary testing. We are really lucky that Brunswick County and CFPUA are continuing to test bi-monthly for PFAS so that we can look and see what the numbers are in our finished tap water at not at any given time, but just where we're trending. Granted, it's a snapshot that is not a most current snapshot. It's always going to be delayed. So we're never going to really be able to see what we're drinking today, but we can see maybe what we drank last month or 2 weeks ago. And another problem is that there is still no federal or state drinking water standards for PFAS. State, when I say there's still no drinking water standards in the state of North Carolina. So here's another problem and a little bit of progress. So we continually pop up as having the most contaminated drinking water in major nationwide tap water studies. So the EWG study that we participated in 2020 had Brunswick County at the top. It had Wilmington in number 5. And really the only reason why you see 1 and 5 is because, we drink off of the river system, then we know our levels fluctuate in the tap water. And so one of the problems with this reporting is that it underreported what we are being exposed to. They used a commercial lab. That commercial lab does not account for a lot of the Chemours compounds. So that's a bit gut-wrenching when we think about it. So problem is not fully solved yet, but we're getting closer, and that's progress. So on the progress front, when this study came out, we were able to get over 1,700 signatures to petition our local school boards to put reverse osmosis filling stations into 49 impacted schools, and they did it. And so when school started this past fall, all 49 impacted schools in New Hanover and Brunswick County had an RO filling station for children to go and access PFAS-free drinking water if they wanted to. It's not a perfect system, but again, our children are a part of our vulnerable population because they are developing and growing at rapid rates. And when they are in a school building, they don't have the options of being able to access clean water. They have to access what's available to them. And so this is a really important step in the right direction. Chemours should be paying for this, but Chemours is not paying for it. Chemours does pay for it if you're a well owner, but they're not paying for it if you're a municipal ratepayer. And that is a bit of an inequity that we maybe all need to look at working together to try and solve, is that, Grays Creek Elementary School is protected under the consent order. And so when a little over 11 or 15 parts per trillion of GenX showed up in their well water, Chemours immediately took them off of, or provided them with an alternative. But we've had 49 schools that have been well over that for years. And unfortunately, those schools, Chemours is not paying for those schools to have access to drinking water. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for us to maybe relook at how can we get Chemours to pay for that. I'll just touch on this briefly. Pittsburgh topped another list that just came out. Consumer Reports released a tap water study last month, and Pittsburgh topped that list. Brunswick County came in 6th. And again, if you look at the levels and you see 80 parts per trillion, I mean, this really just depends on the day that the water was sampled. But what we have is a severely contaminated river system, and we know it. In fact, I think a Harvard study said in 2017 or 2016 that the Cape Fear River was the 3rd most polluted, PFAS polluted river in the entire nation. So if we drill down a bit and we look at what we're drinking currently in each of the impacted counties, and again, Pender County is impacted, but Pender County did not sue. And so being able to access data and information from them is a little less transparent. But there are 2 water districts in Pender County that are serviced by the Cape Fear River. They have the same filtration system as CFPUA. So if you live in Pender County, or you know anyone who lives in Pender County, and you're curious about maybe what the levels would be, then follow the levels that you see reported in CFPUA. They're pretty similar. Here in Brunswick County, I want to point out a couple of things. The most current test results were from April 15th. And if you can look, the levels are rising. We're up to 126 parts per trillion of PFAS. They're testing for 56 PFAS right now, and they detected 27. The top 3 PFAS, again, well over 10 parts per trillion. This red line right here, this is like the 70 part per trillion guess line. EPA's health advisory limit for PFOA and PFOS is at 70 parts per trillion. And the North Carolina consent order as a threshold for getting private wells relief from CMORs is set at that 70 total parts per trillion total PFAS, or 10 of any individuals. And so what we can see right here is a snapshot of the last year for Brunswick County. And you can see on average, Brunswick County residents have been drinking well over 70 parts per trillion of PFAS. One thing to really point out is that this light blue line is the finished tap water readings, and the dark blue line is the raw water readings, and they're very similar to each other, which means Brunswick County's treatment process is less sophisticated, and what is in the river is transferring into the tap water because their filtration just can't capture the PFAS. On a positive note, CFPUA can do a little bit better. CFPUA's light blue line, this is what is the finished tap water line, and the dark blue line is the raw water line. And so you see there's a little more variance between the two, and that's because CFPUA has invested a little more in their filtration methods, or had, before we learned about the contamination. So their website has the most current reading at March 30th. You can see they're testing for 53. Again, this is like double what they were testing for last year, but we know it's not everything that that we were likely exposed to or could likely currently still be in the river system. They're seeing a little bit better readings in the finished tap water, but one thing that I want us to be really concerned about is dry weather events. So this was from March, and then if we go back and we look at Brunswick County, their reading is from April 15th, and we're seeing a spike. We haven't had rain recently, and so there is this kind of prevailing thought, and again, I'm not a scientist, but we've got some really smart ones on this call, so maybe they can chime in at some point or in the chat and give their commentary. But one thing that I had heard is that whenever we have dry weather events, we tend to see higher levels of PFAS in our tap water. So, this is just something for us to be concerned about. And then I know, I'm sure Dana and Kemp can speak on how the consent order could possibly be helping us, especially if there's newer treatments that were just installed before these readings were grabbed. What are other states doing for drinking water standards? Well, there's 6 states that have actually set drinking water standards, and then there's 6 other states that have proposed drinking water standards. And then there's North Carolina over here with a health goal for GenX. And I mean, it is one of the better health goals for GenX. But again, North Carolina has no drinking water standards for PFAS, and that is unacceptable. So there are currently no federal drinking water standards for PFAS. There are no North Carolina state level standards for PFAS in drinking water. 6 have established MCLs, 6 more have pending. 9 states have like a sum total. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because this is the direction that I feel we need to go in, is that we need to do a class approach instead of this compound by compound approach. It will take us well past our lifetimes on this call to create an MCL for each of the 9,000 PFAS that we know are out there. And just as a little point of reminder, if we lived in Massachusetts or Vermont, they would consider our drinking water as unsuitable because it would exceed their state MCLs of a sum total of only 20 PFAS for 5 different PFAS, and our 5 PFAS well exceed those levels. I also wanted to, you can't see it on the chart, but I pulled out the top 3 PFAS for Brunswick and the top 3 PFAS for CFPUA. But what you don't see is that we're still seeing high levels of PFOS and PFOA. I think in the Brunswick County report, PFOS is at 11 parts per trillion. And that's pretty, I thought, alarming, as why are we still seeing this? These 2 compounds are no longer in commercial use, but they're still showing up at what I feel are high levels, especially when you look at what some states are setting for their MCLs for PFOA and PFOS. These levels are down in like the 8 part per trillion, the 10 part per trillion. I mean, we are talking about these compounds are so toxic at trace amounts that we're talking about them at 10 parts per trillion in drinking water. Okay, what's our progress right now happening with the EPA? Well, the EPA finally started the approval process for getting drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS only. And they could have done it again at the beginning of the last administration, but they sat on it for 4 years. And right before they transitioned to the new administration, they initiated the process. This process takes years, but again, it's starting, so yay. The EPA is also adding 29 PFAS to their UCMR report. And again, this is the supplemental report that utilities are given to, and they're required to test for chemicals in their tap water. This is really helpful, but again, it's not enough. And so when we look at problems, we look at the fact that the EPA needs to go further. Great that they added 29 PFAS to this new report that utilities will be required to test in 2023, between 2023 and 2025, but they could do much more than that, and I'll get in that in a minute. EPA is also not committed to looking at PFAS as a class approach, and we need to do that. The EPA also is not prioritizing tier 2 toxicity studies for PFAS. Let's talk about that too. So let's write it down like this cat. You can currently right now send public comment to the EPA on the UCMR 5. And my suggestion, I gave public comment at a meeting, and the feedback that I got was pretty impressive. The EPA encourages hearing from you, and this is why I think it's important, because the EPA is absolutely hearing from industry, and we have to stand up and we have to be as loud as industry. So please know that you may be fatigued and you may feel like your public comments are not getting heard or you're not seeing the progress that you want, but I guarantee you it is getting recorded, it is getting documented, and it makes a difference. So please take the time and encourage all your neighbors and friends to do the same thing. So you can submit public comment on UMC or UCMR 5 by May 10th, and you're basically wanting to recommend that they should do a total fluorine analysis of PFAS and that they need to make sure that the detection levels are set at a health protective limit. So the EPA is not scheduling tier 2 testing. What is tier 2 testing? It's rodent testing. And this is a tricky spot because PETA worked really, really hard to move the EPA away from using rodent testing. And in doing that, the industry loved that idea. So now PETA and the industry are actually sitting side by side saying, yay, EPA, do not do this testing. The only problem with not doing this testing is that the current rules at the EPA say you need to do rodent toxicity testing in order to establish drinking water levels. So here's now the conundrum that we're in, is that drinking water standards are getting delayed again because the EPA is not wanting to fast track or continue to do tier 2 testing. This is their most recent, earlier, I think this week or last week, they updated their schedule for PFAS. And if you look down here, they're not scheduling tier 2 testing until after tier 1 testing is completed, which could take years. So again, this is kind of the game that gets played, and this is where industry can sometimes take what would be a really great idea and turn it in their favor that actually works against us, because while they're not wanting to test rodents, guess who are being tested? Well, not being tested, but exposed. We're being exposed, but we're not getting tested. So we're not really getting treated in a way that I think is humane. It's more than just drinking water, and we know this. But we just wanted to point out some really important studies and make a point here is that we know the PFAS is in the river sediment. We know that it's in fish and it's in the local aquatic life. I think the striped bass study that Maddie talked about before this call started has levels of the striped bass in the Cape Fear River have some of the highest levels in the entire nation. Now, we had talked in another meeting I was on, fishermen are really, really pushing to try and lift the catch and release ban because they just want to start eating the striped bass. And I think we need to have a conversation with DHHS about setting some consumption levels for PFAS or for fish that do have high levels of PFAS. The data exists. There's already a study out there that shows what the levels are. Michigan has already set advisories for fish in contaminated areas, like only eat one a month, or maybe only eat one every 2 months. These are the things that we really need to start talking about. But we also need to be mindful that there's probably going to be a lot of pushback. I just heard that we don't have clams anymore in the Cape Fear estuary. Apparently not in the Fort Fisher area. There used to be a lot of clams, and now they can't even find clams anymore. And it's not from over clamming or fishing or whatever the term is. We know that PFAS collects in seafood because we've seen it in Chinese study. Where are the studies here in the Cape Fear estuary on our seafood? Maybe they're on the way. But we, again, if the studies are on the way, then we also need to be putting a hyper lens on DHHS and demanding that they set limits and levels, or that they begin doing something that's health protective for us, because like LA said, there's a cumulative impact that we need to be concerned with. Not only were we overexposed in our drinking water, but we now have a food system and a food supply that we're also getting exposed to. And I wrote an op-ed a couple of years ago, and in that op-ed, I pointed out that there was a study that showed for the majority of Americans, the highest level of exposure they get from PFAS comes from their food source. We're different because ours was from drinking water because it was so high. But if we took away our drinking water exposure, we would fall into the category of the average American, which means we would still be getting exposed through food. And that's why we need to focus on food contamination of PFAS. We know that we found levels of naphthalene byproduct 2 in the seabirds here in the coastal estuaries of the Cape Fear area, which means that if it's in there, it's likely in other things. So I think there's a good case to keep studying this. Also, we know it's in us. So everybody's aware of the GenX study, because I know Cape Fear Riverwatch was a really strong partner for that. But let's all be mindful to tell our friends too that Brunswick County can now join that study. And Brunswick County is an important piece, I think, in this study, because again, our water system was less sophisticated in Brunswick County, which means likely the exposures were a little higher. So please make sure when this study relaunches, it had paused during COVID, but when it relaunches, please, please, please work to get people signed up for this study. This information is really important. So what are some things we can do? Right now at the federal level, the EPA just simply must act on PFAS. And in fact, the EPA needs to. Congress can write the laws and Congress can make more laws, but ultimately EPA is the one that enforces the laws and acts on the laws. And so if EPA is not doing their job, then really what do we got going on here? I like this cartoon from Rube Goldberg because it just reminds me of just what industry likes to do with our government bodies, and also what sometimes we tend to do with our own systems is that we make things super complicated when really you could just pick up the napkin and use it with your hands. So we just need to be mindful to cut through some of the widgets and really focus on the important aspects. So some positives. We know this guy. This guy's our guy. This is Administrator Regan, and he knows PFAS really well. Some of the things that he's done so far just in the last week is he announced a council on PFAS. So I sit on the leadership team of the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, and this was one of the things that we had asked for from the Biden administration. But we had asked for kind of like a PFAS czar to look over all administrations, similar to what they have with the climate czar. So to see that this is happening at the EPA level is literally the next best thing. So we're really happy and pleased to see that, but we also are cautiously optimistic because we want to make sure it goes in a relevant direction. The EPA just said that they closed the low volume exemption loophole, or that they're going to close the low volume exemption loophole, and that's really important. So updates on 2 TSCA petitions that we are part of that I think are important for North Carolina. So Cape Fear Riverwatch, Clean Cape Fear, and 4 other North Carolina groups band together and filed a petition. This is basically, we're requesting that the EPA order Chemours to pay for toxicity and human health studies on 54 PFAS that we know they released and released into the environment and exposed us to. Now, TSCA basically says, if you're going to make a product and it's a hazardous product or it's a toxic product, you need to show us, or you want to release it, you need to show us that it's not toxic or that it is safe to release into the environment. We know Chemours and DuPont did not do that. So basically this petition is saying, hey, EPA, you have the authority, so go ahead and do it. So we filed this with the last administration. The last administration denied our petition. We had 60 days to file a lawsuit, so we did. So we do have a lawsuit pending with the EPA. And then we also resubmitted the petition because we really would like just for the EPA to do their job. We don't want to have to go through a lengthy legal battle, but we will if we have to. And so right now, the Biden administration is reviewing the petition. Administrator Regan has asked for a little bit of an extension to kind of review it and get a better understanding of exactly what all is being asked. So we are in a holding pattern with this. One thing that you can do, though, if you want to feel a part of the solution, is you can send a letter to the Biden administration. There's some students at the University of Cincinnati, and they created a letter campaign to pressure to just provide some public pressure to the Biden administration. And so you can visit our website, or I'll post the link after I'm done with my presentation, where you can sign on to this letter and spread it around the country and just get as many voices united so that they know that this is something that we are very aware of and we're very concerned about. The other petition that we have out there, and this one was just filed recently, Earth Justice led this petition. They got 15 groups to sign on, and then they included Clean Cape Fear and NC Black Alliance and Democracy Green. This one is to close loopholes. And so again, we had just talked about one loophole that's happening at the EPA, that's the low volume exemption loophole, but that's not the only one. So while we were really excited to see Administrator Regan say that he was going to close the low volume exemption, we want to make sure that he does more than just that, because there's a couple of other areas that he needs to do, and byproducts is the biggest one for us. There currently byproducts can just pass through and don't have any sort of recourse, and the byproducts is exactly our problem with Chemours and DuPont. So we want to make sure that this petition gets done and gets across the finish line. So every ounce of support that can be sent and given to Administrator Regan to let him know that this is important to North Carolinians, we need to work on that. Low releases and exposures and polymer exemptions, those also need to be closed. There's a lot of loopholes in that. So again, if you're interested in reading the petition, I can share all of that information. So again, we talked about the EPA really is the focus. We need to get the EPA to act, but if the EPA is not going to act, Congress is ready to act. And so here's two bills that I thought were really important to keep an eye out on at the federal level. The PFAS Action Act of 2021, it has bipartisan support. It was submitted in the House, and it does some really fantastic things. It is a very comprehensive bill. It expedites drinking water standards. It requires that PFAS be labeled as hazardous substance. It puts limits on discharges, or it tells the EPA that it needs to put limits on discharges. It's basically what the EPA says it's going to do, but this law, if Congress enacts it, is basically giving a timeline saying, fine, you're going to do it, but you're going to do it in this time frame. You're going to do it in 2 years instead of 10. So this is kind of where we see this law being really important. It provides funding for utilities, which has really been a sticky widget for the utilities community, because they don't want to be caught in a hazardous designation for something that they don't feel they had any say in. They just receive the toxins, and then you have to spend a lot of money to filter it out. And so they want to kind of get a little compensation for that. No incineration, no new PFAS health studies. Those are kind of the TSCA ones I just talked about. This would kind of strengthen and further that. And then put a voluntary cookware label, which is kind of yay, but let's just put like a real cooking, like no voluntaries. Let's just make it like standard, but oh well. PFAS Accountability Act is probably the most ballsy piece of legislation that we have seen, but it's about time. This one's bicameral, but it's not bipartisan. So more than two Democrats, but the Democrats in the Senate and the House have submitted twin bills, and this is looking for medical monitoring. And this is a really important bill for us because we know we were exposed, many of us, for decades, but we don't know what those exposures mean. And this would give us a very easy path to require that the polluter, the responsible party, pays for our medical monitoring. And it would also amend TSCA, again, talking about some of these loopholes that make it nearly impossible. Something that I want everyone to put on their radar is that Congress is talking, and the administrations federally are all talking about some really big legislation and a lot of spending on recovery and infrastructure. And we need to make sure that there's a lens on sustainability when these items get talked about. These are good, necessary bills, but they also can get used by corporations. And I'm pretty certain, this is just my personal opinion, that Chemours is just primed to take the money, and we are going to get left with a lot of the harm if Chemours takes that money and increases their volumes or increases their manufacturing and ramps it up. And there's no measures put in place to even question whether what they're doing is sustainable. We know PFAS is not sustainable. So again, if we're going to start putting PFAS in all these solar panels, well, then what's going to happen to those solar panels when we're done using them? That type of stuff needs to be written into some of these spending bills. And so just have an eye on that. We also need to start encouraging green chemistry. The EPA actually has outlined what green chemistry is. It's a 12-point principle. And we need to maybe see some attachments in spending for reinvesting in innovation that can move us away from PFAS. Because what the industry wants us to know is that these are essential products. This is essential for modern living. It's only essential for modern living if we require it to be essential for modern living. But America is the birthplace of innovation. We can spend the money and we can do the good work, because that's what America is known for, to find chemistry that is less toxic, that is not, that does not, take generations to degrade, and that can still probably do the same thing, if not maybe even better at some point in time. So that's what we really need to start putting our focus on. LA talked about the National Academies of Science, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I will tell you there's 2 other town halls. The town halls are focused on the middle of the country and then the western part of the country, and I highly recommend you attend one or both, and that you give public comment. There'll be a section at the very end where you can give a 3-minute statement, and they want to hear from you, and that's really important. The things that we are focusing on with the National Academies of Science is that we need to make them aware that the data gaps need to stop, and that we are aware they have data gaps. And just because there are data gaps in the health effects study, that does not mean that they shouldn't act. They need to work around those data gaps. And we also want them to give us guidance, not on 1 PFAS or 2 PFAS, but on all PFAS as a mixture, because we know we're being exposed to a mixture of PFAS. It is a hard ask, but it is a necessary ask. And that's what we need to keep reminding these scientists and these health professionals, is that they may think it's hard work and that it may be tricky, but it is necessary because it is our reality. Okay. There's a ton of health effects that are happening. A lot of us probably can relate to some of these. These are the ones that we hear about on a regular basis when we talk about PFAS. The ones that concern us is, we may not see a spike in breast cancer, like a breast cancer cluster or a spike in breast cancer, but what we're hearing from the breast cancer community is that they're seeing breast cancer diagnosed at younger ages in our community versus older ages in the national average. So where the averages are about the same in North Carolina, or in our area of North Carolina, and in the nation, they're not the same when you look at the ages that are getting impacted. So it's the same thing when we look at maybe testicular cancer. We look at when we look at colon cancer, I'm hearing a lot of people who are just having rare forms of it, or are having to do reoccurring treatments, 3 rounds of chemotherapy for a colon cancer, that maybe in another part of the country where there wasn't less exposure, it would have been a little less. So these are the things we're worried about. When we see that liver toxicity for GenX, by the way, was at 1 part per trillion, I think. Then I'll have to find that study, but it was written in an NRDC report. So we really kind of need to take a lens and look at maybe non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or what's really happening in this community. Epidemiological studies are super hard and they're hard to fund. And so it's always difficult to get these answers. And so we're really trying to push through this hard lift.
Emily, 1 minute, please. Thanks.
We're getting there. Yep, I'm almost done. Okay, Mind the Store is a great place to go. LA had talked about how to get PFAS out of food packaging. Mind the Store is really pushing that initiative, and you can join the fun there. NRDC has just released a toxicity database, and there's 742 studies on 29 PFAS. You can go there and really see what some of the health effects are. Someone had talked about building materials, and Green Science Policy has just released a report. And in that report, they offer some solutions and some suggestions. And then if you want to start buying PFAS-free products, you can go to PFAS Central. They have been updating this regularly. Green Science Policy heads that up. It's really awesome. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Emily.
Next up is, I can't remember who goes after me. I'm so sorry.
It's
Dr.
me.
Jaimie DeWitt.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for letting me come here and join with you and talk a little bit about, I don't know why my whiteboard popped up. Hang on. As I try to get my presentation open and shared with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we address some of the health concerns. But before I do that, I want to go into a little bit of some of the bigger issues of science associated with PFAS so you understand how they influence toxicity. So I'm an associate professor at East Carolina University, And I've been studying PFAS in my laboratory since about 2005. I actually started in my postdoc at the EPA, and I have continued since I joined ECU in 2008. And I really appreciate that LA and Emily touched on a lot of really important issues associated with exposure, as well as some of the tools that you can use to avoid PFAS. But I want to go through some additional acronyms because I know everybody in the PFAS world is really excited about acronyms. I wanted to point out that I do have a little bit of bias. I have funding to study PFAS, and I also serve or have served as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS. So I am working to help phase out PFAS from products and processes, and I'm not afraid to say that. As has been mentioned, there are a huge number of PFAS. Current estimates put the number of individual compounds at just under 10,000, and these seem to be growing each and every day in terms of numbers. We know the most about PFAS that we call PFAAs. These are the perfluoroalkyl acids, and they include compounds like PFOA, PFOS, and GenX. But you can see that there are many different types of PFAS. And as we start to understand more about analyzing and detecting these PFAS, we start to ask, well, what does this mean in terms of toxicity? And what do all of these compounds mean when they're mixed together and when they enter our bodies? And I think those are the concerns that many of us have. What happens when PFAS get into our bodies? So I wanted to go through what we do know about PFAS once they enter our bodies. We call PFAS forever chemicals, and we often call them forever chemicals because of how long they exist in the environment. It takes them a really long time to degrade naturally in the environment, if at all. But that persistence really is important when we think about how PFAS interact within our bodies and produce adverse health outcomes or toxicological outcomes. We tend to understand PFAS by looking at animal models like mice. Emily mentioned rodents. And you can see here that in mice, they're excreted somewhat rapidly, at least for a mouse, this is kind of rapid. So it can be hours to weeks in a mouse, but then when we translate that over to the amount of time that PFAS lasts in our bodies, it could be days to months to years. Because PFAS have that long of a period of time to interact within our bodies, it means that they have the potential to interact with cells and molecules and processes in our bodies to produce those adverse health outcomes. We also know that PFAS can move around quite a bit in the environment, and because they can move from points where they're excreted or put into the environment through disposal processes or accidental releases, we know that they can move great distances. So where that PFAS is released means that it can spread over long distances through the air, through the water, through biota to influence or expose a greater number of individuals. So even though we have a lot of BIPOC communities that live close to landfills and get the brunt of exposure, there is the potential for emissions from landfills to move beyond that direct source of release into a leachate pond or into a water treatment facility. So this mobility means that a greater number of people likely are exposed than just those who live in proximity to a facility that makes or releases PFAS into the environment. We also understand that many PFAS can move from the environment into our bodies. For a chemical to produce an adverse health outcome or a toxicological effect, it has to be able to get into our bodies. We understand that PFAS can get into our bodies through the water that we drink and the food that we eat. And now we're starting to learn about what PFAS might do to our bodies when we breathe them in or when we absorb them through our skin as we wear clothing or as fighter fighters wear gear that may be contaminated with PFAS. And because PFAS are persistent in our bodies, when we take a little bit into our bodies each day, and because it takes them so long to get excreted or eliminated from our bodies, that means that they can build up within our bodies to produce those adverse health outcomes. So I wanted to touch really briefly a little bit on Toxicology 101. We talk a lot about exposure. We talk about how much PFAS is in the environment and how much PFAS can get into our bodies, but we really have to think about that internal concentration. We take a little bit from the environment into our bodies because they're excreted slowly, they can build up. And when chemicals build up in our bodies, they have the opportunity to interact with cells and signals and molecules that can lead to those adverse health outcomes. So toxicity really means undesirable outcomes. They're health effects that we don't want. As Emily mentioned, they can range from cancer to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to immune dysfunction. And that toxicity really starts with that chemical interaction. So we now know that PFAS can interact with a variety of proteins in our bodies. Some of these proteins are enzymes, some of these proteins are receptors that can turn signals on and off in our bodies associated with the immune system, the endocrine system, how we metabolize things. So really understanding what's going on at the molecular level will help us to build better models so that we can better predict what other PFAS that we haven't yet studied could do in terms of adverse health outcomes in our bodies. Jackie Bangma is a postdoc at the US EPA, and she put this slide together. And I think this slide is really great because it highlights the different ways that we can ask questions about health effects of PFAS. We can look at what PFAS will do in cells, and those approaches are fairly rapid and can give us an idea of some of those molecular signals that might be impacted by PFAS. But really, to understand what PFAS are doing in our bodies, we have to look at living organisms. That might include rodent models to ask questions about how the liver is affected or how the immune system is affected. And then we can translate that information from rodent models to predict or estimate what be happening in humans. As Emily mentioned, epidemiological studies can be challenging to do for a variety of reasons. We might not get the right diversity of individuals into a particular study to understand how everybody is being impacted by exposure. They can take a while to put together. They can be very costly. But those epidemiological studies also give us information on the ground about what people are experiencing from their actual exposures. So really, when we try to understand what's going on with PFAS, we have to look at those cell-based studies, animal studies, and studies of people who have been exposed through food or water or other sites of contamination to really put that full picture together to then establish those health protective measures so that we can ensure that people are no longer impacted by exposure. Biomonitoring is one of those ways that we can start to build up information about what types of PFAS are within people's bodies, the diversity of PFAS, the quantities of PFAS. And so by collecting blood and other samples from humans who have been exposed, we can start to build a better picture of maybe this population has exposure to these types of compounds, or this population has exposure to these types of compounds. And then we can start to better predict what health outcomes might be associated with those exposures. But we still have a ways to go before we can really accurately predict what health outcomes may arise from exposure to particular PFAS or mixtures of PFAS. We do know that at least for the general population, levels of some PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, for example, have decreased over time. But for those living in Wilmington, we also know that exposures to these two compounds appear to be higher than what general populations in the United States are experiencing. So even though in some populations we see declines in some PFAS, we see increases in other populations, which means that we need better understanding about demographics of people who are getting exposed so that we really do understand who is more at risk so that we can incorporate appropriate interventions and potential health monitoring for specific populations that might have a different type of exposure, a different level of exposure than the general population, for example. Everybody is probably familiar with the C8 Science Panel study, and this particular study was of a population in West Virginia and Ohio. It was featured in the film Dark Waters, and this study is particularly notable because it included up to 70,000 individuals. And this study helped us to establish a baseline of some of the health effects that we know are most strongly associated with PFAS exposure. And those health effects are listed here. We've got kidney and testicular cancer, high cholesterol, pregnancy-induced hypertension and preeclampsia, thyroid disease, and ulcerative colitis. But we also understand from other epidemiological studies that a variety of other types of diseases are now being confirmed. We can confirm some of these studies in animal populations or in animal models. This is why we call PFAS multi-system toxicants. And this is one of the reasons that it can be very challenging to start to answer specific questions about PFAS because they impact a variety of different systems. Studies with experimental animal models are really important because they help us to confirm what we've seen in human studies. They help to establish that causal link between exposure to a particular PFAS or groups of PFAS and health effects. And they really let us get into those molecular level changes that we need to develop to build better models to predict what types of understudied PFAS might produce adverse health outcomes. This is a list of some of the PFAS mechanisms that we've uncovered, and I know this is a big, complicated list of some of these molecular effects, but each one of these effects allow us to then develop models to start to test additional PFAS to ask, will they produce cancer? Will they impact the immune system? Will they impact energy production? And because we can tie these two types of studies together with molecular level effects, we can start to build those better models that the EPA is working on so that we can better predict and then move into that tier 2 toxicity testing that Emily talked about. So if we can order some of the PFAS that are in the environment for additional testing, we're going to get more information on maybe subclasses of PFAS so that we don't have to test PFAS one by one by one. This was already mentioned in terms of the MCLs, and some of these websites already were highlighted as well. So these are some websites that will give you great information about what you can do individually for your health so that you feel like you have some control over your level of exposure. And I'm going to stop right there and say thank you for all of the folks who have funded my laboratory. I do research on PFAS to understand what it's doing to the immune system. So I appreciate you listening, and I look forward to some of your questions. Thank you. And I believe Emily Sutton is next.
Hey everyone, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I'm Emily Sutton. I'm the Haw River Keeper at Haw River Assembly, and I am fortunate enough to be able to work with Jaimie DeWitt and community members like Emily Donovan and LA and the Cape Fear River Watch folks. So I wanted to kind of broaden the scope of this and give a better sense of what's going on upstream. So most of y'all on this call are very aware of what's happening with the Keymores situation, but in the upper Cape Fear and the Haw River watershed, the sources are a lot more diffuse. So I wanted to kind of spend some time going over that and what that looks like. So this is a great graphic from the PFAS testing network, but one thing that we see in the Haw is that these sources of PFAS are not just coming from one bad actor, like the Keymores situation. What we found is that a lot of the highest levels of sources are actually coming from wastewater treatment plants. And so the wastewater treatment plants themselves are not necessarily creating the problem, but they have pre-treatment users. And so those pre-treatment users are industrial facilities that send their waste through that treatment process. So at any given wastewater treatment plant, there may be 10 to 30 significant industrial users sending waste. So it's really hard to tease apart what those individual sources of PFAS could be going into each wastewater treatment plant. But it's not just the wastewater effluent that we're concerned about here. It's also what's coming in through the biosolids. So the biosolids are being land applied on fields directly adjacent to streams in a lot of cases. And those biosolids are also being applied to the same field over and over and over again for years. So that has great potential to contaminate groundwater as well. And then similar to what we saw with the Keymores example, the air emissions that are coming from these industrial facilities could also be contaminating drinking water and groundwater. And then I know LA and Emily Donovan already mentioned landfills. That's one of our biggest concerns in the Haw River watershed as well. A lot of these landfills are in communities of color, and so we're concerned about that impacting groundwater, but the leachate also is collected and sent through the wastewater treatment plants to be processed. So that's another load of PFAS that's coming in through the wastewater treatment plants. So like I mentioned, the pretreatment program has the potential to regulate these industrial users, but of course, PFAS and other contaminants like 1,4-dioxane are not regulated at the pretreatment level. So these wastewater treatment plants have a permit for each one of these pretreatment users to regulate heavy metals and solids and other things that are coming through, but it's not treated or even disclosed in a pretreatment permit what PFAS could potentially be in that effluent stream. So the landfill leachate is processed through wastewater treatment plants, like I mentioned, and that could be a very small concentration of volume, but the levels in that landfill leachate is typically higher than what we see in other sources. So that's a major concern. Also, construction and demolition landfills in North Carolina are not typically lined, and those construction and demolition landfills are often filled with things that come out of houses. So LA mentioned carpets being really high in this stuff. That's all going into these construction and demolition landfills when things are being, when apartments are being demolished or rebuilt. So all of these landfills are a huge concern. In the Haw River watershed, the municipalities that we're most concerned about are Burlington, Greensboro, and Reedsville. We worked with Southern Environmental Law Center in November of 2019 to issue a notice of intent to sue the city of Burlington for PFAS discharges. And that would require disclosure of where these PFAS are coming from within the system. And we're currently working with Greensboro to monitor all of their different influence streams into their wastewater treatment plant to really understand the scope of the problem and identify sources. Greensboro and Reedsville also contribute PFAS to the Haw River watershed, but the major concern there for industrial contaminants is 1,4-dioxane. And we're also working with Southern Environmental Law Center to challenge a special order by consent for Greensboro that would regulate their 1,4-dioxane discharges. So what are some solutions? We've heard a couple policy solutions from Emily and LA. So I'm just going to focus on regulatory limits. The short-term solution that we need obviously is to protect drinking water users. The long-term would be to remove it from the source entirely, but that could take years. And right now, drinking water users are being exposed to this at dangerous levels every day. Jaimie mentioned how the toxicity builds up in exposure, and people in the Haw River watershed and the Cape Fear River watershed communities have been exposed to this for years. So we need funding to have safe drinking water treatment for all of those communities. And right now, that looks like homeowners are investing in reverse osmosis treatment for their own homes. But that doesn't cover renters or people who depend on municipal water for their source. But the long-term solution, of course, is to keep this out of the water to begin with, to protect all uses of a river system. So we really need to have regulatory limits as a class of PFAS. So this looks like having monitoring resources and guidance for all pathways of contamination, and whether that's the pretreatment users in the permits or in biosolids, all of those sources need to be tested and monitored and limited for potential pathways of contamination. Emily Donovan talked a little bit about PFAS removal and total organic fluorine. And so having that kind of testing also captures any precursors. So what we're seeing is we may be testing for 29 PFAS, but if we're not getting significant spikes of those numbers, there could be more precursors that are combining as it moves through a river. To test for all of these different types of PFAS and their precursors, and then to limit those before they ever enter the environment. So I want to talk a little bit about environmental justice concerns. LA brought this up earlier about the difference between homeowners and renters, especially. So right now, the burden of safe drinking water is the cost. It's expensive to have a reverse osmosis treatment system in your own home. And so only the families that can afford it can provide safe drinking water. So this leaves a lot of low-income communities at risk. Right now, there's a significant knowledge gap about what the levels are and who we're reaching with this information. And in Pittsburgh, the town leaders have done little to nothing to notify their consumers, or their drinking water customers, about this issue. So there's been a lot of gaps in information and resources for the community. This has to be solved on a town level. So if the municipality of Pittsburgh, for example, is serving an entire community, that entire community needs to have access to safe water. A couple other concerns that we've seen are different municipalities handle their waste differently. So for example, in Greensboro, they incinerate their waste. So that incineration is usually happening in communities of color or in communities of low wealth. And then we also talked about landfill leachate, and I have a slide to show the difference here in landfill concentrations. So this map talks about how concentrated minority groups are in relation to landfill locations. So in North Carolina, the average population is about 30% non-white. But you see all of these dots are locations of landfills. So where it's much darker red, these are concentrations of minority communities that are 70% or higher. So if the average is 30%, we look at each one of these locations of landfills, they are predominantly in communities of majority minority. So lastly, I wanted to talk about a little bit of policy stuff. There are a couple bills that have been introduced this session that are not as strong as we'd like to see, but it is small incremental steps in the right direction. And then the list of bills at the bottom here, I'm not going into this, but every session we have a couple great champions in our legislature who repeatedly introduce strong bills on PFAS. And it takes a lot to introduce bills that won't move. And so I really encourage all of you to reach out to your representatives and demand strong PFAS policy, and thank those champions who repeatedly introduce bills that won't move. Other things that you can do, the triennial review is a process that happens in North Carolina every 3 years. And right now, PFAS standards for surface water are not on the triennial review to set standards across the state. So the comment period is about to open up, and we are going to be pushing the agency really hard to set standards on PFAS as a class for surface water. So we'll send out information about how to engage in that process. Also, disclosure and notification. Department of Environmental Quality right now has the authority to require disclosure on permits for PFAS compounds. This is a requirement in the Clean Water Act, and they have the authority to do so, but they haven't. So that's one issue that we repeatedly bring up to both the Environmental Management Commission and Department of Environmental Quality. And the last thing I'll talk about is that the Toxic Substances Narrative Standard Act in North Carolina, we have written narrative standards about what is safe in for known carcinogens, and it is a level that is unacceptable for health risks and shall be based on a carcinogenic potency factor of no more than 1 in 1 million. So that's a narrative standard that exists on the books that is not being adhered to right now in North Carolina. So I'm going to wrap up quickly so we can hear from Elijah and have plenty of time for questions at the end of this. But I just want to thank the folks at Cape Fear River Watch for organizing this.
Thank you, Emily. Eli, you are up, and thanks everyone for sticking around. This will be great. Eli is a filmmaker, and he's got a great shorter presentation to share, so hang tight.
Yeah, so I just want to start by thanking all of these wonderful colleagues who've gone before me, elevating some of the fantastic work they're doing. I want to give you all, well, first, my screen's coming through, right? Can I get a thumbs up here?
Yep, you're good.
Terrific. So I just want to give the shortest backstory on me for those of you that don't know. So my name is Elijah Yetter-Bowman, and actually for the past closing on 4 years now, my life has revolved around basically nothing but PFAS and trying to communicate that story to the world. And it came to be that way. Funny enough, I grew up in Wilmington, and I was very involved in the artistic scene and theater and the film world. But because of issues that had affected my family, some serious health issues that affected my mother, I also had a really strong interest in health. And so I ended up leaving Wilmington to go to UNC Chapel Hill because I planned on becoming a physician and being really involved in that. And it was kind of ironic. I was getting to the end of my coursework, finishing up my second level organic chemistry classes, when all of a sudden 2017 rolls around and we get the news, hey, there's this really dangerous chemical and related chemicals in the drinking water. And this was a really stark moment for me, as I know it was for many of us. Basically involved a lot of quick research and finding out that the issue that had befallen our town of Wilmington seemed to be history repeating itself. As we know now, it's very well documented, the case of the Ohio River Valley, elevated by Rob Balot and so much of the work. And so I sort of had a breaking point because it seemed so crazy that we could have this very well documented case, and yet all of a sudden it seemed like we were basically repeating the same mistakes. And I have to give a shout out to Dr. Jaimie DeWitt and Dr. Larry Cahoon, who are some of the first mentors I had in trying to unpack this. So one of the big catalytic moments for this was back in 2018, the Chemours Company, right, which is one of DuPont's spinoffs, held what they called the town hall. And they basically, gathered a whole bunch of locals into this tiny little church around Fayetteville. I'll just tell you exactly what happened. I mean, basically, they repeated a couple of talking points, trying to downplay all of the existing science around these compounds. And if you know anything about DuPont's history with PFAS pollution, this is sort of their default. Unfortunately, it seems like it is very common to basically downplay existing science and throw a lot of skepticism or uncertainty with regard to health significance of what they are, in this case, legally culpable for. And so this is really eye-opening for me to actually witness, executives, as we see one here, Paul Kirsch, flagrantly lying to our state. And basically saying, well, there's no reason to think this is going to harm your health. It's really not that bad. And so this was sort of the moment of no return for me. And I decided to put my personal career trajectory on hold to focus on this issue because it's something much bigger than myself. And there's so many folks that I've met throughout this journey. One I show here, Jonathan, is a well owner around the facility. And he, basically gave us a tour of his house. He's a plumber by trade, and so he's a really good understanding of, all of the many areas in which water, touches you in your house. And he pointed out how one of the interim solutions that was offered by the company to him as a well owner was 3 different reverse osmosis filters on 3 of his sinks. And as he pointed out, that's great when you're using that for cold water. But what does it do if you're taking a bath, especially if you have any sort of open wounds? When he found out that there was this crisis affecting his personal water, he had just had surgery and he had recently been soaking in his bathtub, multiple nights with open wounds. And so that's still one area that really troubled him. But I think it really helped and crystallized. I mean, there's so many folks I've worked with and some of which are on this call, really showcasing what it can be like, how bad it can be when you realize, okay, my sole source of water is basically completely unsafe. And now I feel like I'm captive inside of my home. And Jonathan really, I think, captures that very well. Also in 2018, the EPA had a hearing here in North Carolina to discuss this. And I think, as a lot of my colleagues pointed out, this was sort of a frustrating moment, though we had some incredible speakers at this event who really kind of got at the heart of why this isn't super useful. Unfortunately, we saw, not too much came from it in terms of our last administration. Dare I say, basically nothing happened. But it was, I think, a very eye-opening moment to see so many community members really calling that out directly. And so I just want to point out Ms. Deborah Maxwell, who I believe is on the call with us, did such a good job at really pointing that out, so many practical limitations. And then I want to move on to some of the amazing science that our state has really been championing. And I'll point out, Dr. Jane Hoppin is leading the GenX exposure study, which is really fantastic. And, this, her work and some of the other things that have developed out of the PFAS testing network, I think, is really inspiring to, honestly, the entire world. While we aren't seeing a whole lot of legislative change in our state or policy change per se, we are seeing a tremendous body of science. And the reality is, for fixing a problem that's this complicated, the more precisely we can figure everything out, thanks to the help of these brilliant scientists, the closer we are to really addressing it. And I want to point out, too, that this journey has taken us to finding all types of different community champions, like many of whom are on the call or just presented across the country. So I want to point out Brenda Hampton, who we met at the National PFAS Conference in Boston back in 2019. So Brenda is this incredible person. She basically, from an entirely grassroots perspective, helped to first elevate that there was a water pollution issue for her mom's community in rural northern Alabama. She found this out shortly after moving back in with her because she had to donate one of her kidneys to her mother because they had been failing. And she later surmised that it was likely due to the contamination in her community. And so Brenda basically, true hero of a person, figured out a way to provide safer drinking water to her mother and so many different people in her community. And one thing that's really spectacular is Brenda had a key part in the change that McDonald's has recently opted for, that some of my colleagues elevated earlier, which is that a few years ago, she started a petition directly calling on McDonald's to say, hey, can you stop using PFAS in your products? Like, this just seems unnecessary and really it's doing so much more bad than it is good. And 2 years later, now we see McDonald's has voluntarily opted by 2025 to phase out all PFAS in their packaging. And I think this is just an example of the amount of power that we as individuals, especially when we work together, really do have. I would love to encourage everyone to think about other ways that we can do this, other companies that we can create pressure on, who maybe aren't manufacturers of these materials, but are simply using them, right, because of the added luxury. Because for all of us consumers, we didn't know for the longest time that the convenience of not, staining your carpet with wine came with the downside that now you're, inhaling and absorbing these dangerous materials. And I want to just bring it back home to Rob Bellot, because his story, which has been documented in the film Dark Waters or The Devil We Know, as well as the book that he wrote, Exposure, which I encourage all of you to check out those resources if you haven't, really just hammers home the power that we do have as individuals. And I don't want to take up too much time, so we have room for questions. So I have a brief clip from our film that I'd like to share, where Rob sort of captures this idea.
No audio.
No audio? Okay, I got you. 2 seconds. Bear with me, folks. All right.
We spent 20 years trying to get information out about PFOA. And once that information started trickling out, and the company finally agreed to start phasing out PFOA, DuPont simply tweaked it into something new. Started making it in Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2017, when the news broke that GenX was being found in the drinking water. We start to see the same questions and the same answers from the company that we heard 20 years ago. Well, there's no evidence that this causes any harm to people drinking it.
If you find a replacement chemical that serves the same purpose in the product, why would it function any differently inside of a living creature?
Look at what's happening here. This is like the sequel to PFOA, because once we finally started getting information and the scientists finally started understanding what the health effects and threats were from PFOA, we tweaked it a bit. The company simply changed it a little bit, called it something new, and suddenly everybody's told we have to start all over again. And the troubling thing was that there were in fact studies that had been done. In fact, the first cancer study for GenX, this particular study, this cancer study, showed that GenX caused the same 3 tumors that PFOA did: liver, pancreatic, and testicular tumors. So that should have been sending red flags.
I'm hoping if people are able to see this story and see what transpired, beginning in West Virginia and continuing through to what's going on now in North Carolina and all over the world, that people will understand we are all sharing the same problem. We all have these man-made toxic chemicals in our blood. Our children are being born pre-polluted with these chemicals. There is something we can do about it. And I'm hoping that people are inspired and encouraged by this story to see people like Wilbur Tennant, people that were able to stand up, and even though they were individuals, and even though there were massive forces on the other side, entire legal systems, regulatory systems, corporate systems, we can still fix this.
I promise you that.
And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I just have one last point I wanted to bring up. A lot of my colleagues have shared some excellent websites and resources for understanding different areas of PFAS. And I've been working with the North Carolina State Superfund team to kind of put these in one single spot. So you have a one-stop shop. This will direct you to all of those. And I'll be dropping a link to that in the chat so everyone has access to it. But thanks so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know that this was a lot of information, everybody. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, LA. Thank you, Emily Donovan, Emily Sutton, and Dr. Jaimie DeWitt. I do want to let y'all know Dr. Jaimie DeWitt is up at 3 a.m. where she is right now. So everybody give her a round of applause, please, for her dedication. It is insane. We're so grateful that she could join us. Also, I do want to point out that I completely failed in my opening segment to introduce Cape Fear Riverkeeper Kemp Burdett. So I just wanted to make sure that I did that. So sorry. My co-director and partner in crime in all of our PFAS work. And I would also like to just point out real quick, a happy birthday to LA. It is her birthday weekend. So we just wanted to say happy birthday to her. I would love to open this up to questions. I do want to let everyone know that we are going to share the link to this whole presentation in our email that we send to everybody on our email list next Wednesday. So please make sure you're on our email list. You'll get the link to the full presentation, the full recording. We will also put together a document of action items and information based on the questions in the chat and the action items that our great speakers shared with us. So we'll compile all that for everybody and share that as well. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. I do want to point out one of our guests here, Diane Cotter, who is a champion for PFAS firefighters, and just wanted to give her a round of applause. And if Diane, if you'd like to share your update, please do. Otherwise, I did include it in the chat. You need to unmute. There you go.
I'm just so impressed with everyone's presentation today. It is staggering the amount of knowledge, and the way you break it down is phenomenal. You know, I've been like a one-trick pony in this for a long time, and I'm just so impressed by everybody. Thank you all. Thanks so very much.
Thank you, Diane. So anybody have any questions? If you'd like to unmute yourself, please do. I would ask that you direct questions. We could open up with questions to Emily Sutton, who has to jump off soon, and Dr. DeWitt, who probably needs a nap. Otherwise, please feel free to jump in with questions.
Hi, I have a question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Hi, my name's Genevieve Gary, and I'm a PhD student at ECU. I've worked with Dr. DeWitt and some other people on this call, and I am looking to see if there's interest for studies on how people are being affected in an emotional way to PFAS, and if different groups are getting information equally, and if different groups are being affected differently from this problem in the Wilmington region, Brunswick County. I also went to UNCW and was there when the news broke. So if anyone has some comment on that or wants to get a hold of me, I'll put my email in the chat. But I am working to try and get funding for this so that we can have, in the academic world, as well as work with community partners, you know, how people are really affected by this just beyond their health statistics.
Thank you, Genevieve. And if you don't mind, I'll include your email in the informational update I sent. Okay, I'm going to do that. Any other questions?
And Dana, if I could say really quick to Genevieve, if that's okay. Really, I just want to say deep appreciation to that being a study. A lot of our communities, for example, you know, I mentioned Florence as a, you know, but there's been many hurricanes before and after, but like a lot of kids, we were working with the school system in Robeson County because some of the children, and this is pre-pandemic, of course, were having PTSD. Whenever rain would hit just the ceiling or the roof rather of the schools. And that was just because of the fear of the flood. And so when we talk about like these impacts, especially in communities with cumulative impact, how are we supporting them with mental health support? And what does it mean for that to also be included in future clinical studies to say, okay, this is how this is showing up and this is how it's impacting our kids. But how does it, and how can that be the corporation's responsibility as well? That's the other question that I think is bounced back, is like, how can it be a financial responsibility on the corporation to support communities with that kind of recovery and restitution as well? Because invisible wounds, and I say this as a former Air Force wife, invisible wounds are ignored. And our military folks go through this all the time, and our communities are suffering similar PTSD. So thank you.
Thank you, LA. There's a question in the chat requesting information about what our universities are contributing. I wonder if Dr. DeWitt would be able to provide some insight there.
Sure, I did provide a quick text return to that comment. I see lots and lots of grant applications being submitted that I get asked to review for different agencies that concern PFAS health effects. Many of these focus on some of those mechanisms that I mentioned in my talk, some of those molecular level changes, not as much of the descriptive toxicology, which helps us to establish some of those guidelines for protecting health. But when these types of funding approaches are partnered together, then we can start to develop a better understanding to create those maximum contaminant levels or reference doses, which are used to inform maximum contaminant levels. So I feel hopeful that there's lots of activity at the university level across various universities within the US and even beyond.
And I'd like to add to that our North Carolina researchers are amazing. We've got, you know, folks at NC State, at UNCW, at Duke, like Dr. DeWitt said, submitting grant applications. We've got 2 out that we're waiting to hear back from some scientists at NC State. You saw Maddie here earlier. They're working on an alligator study in PFAS and a striped bass study in PFAS. And then, of course, the NC Collaboratory. I do want to make a note that the funding for the NC Collaboratory was part of a budget bill a couple years ago. This is science that is funded by the state. Research is ongoing. You can check out the link to that information that those researchers are providing when we send that in our email on Wednesday. We do want to make sure to note, I want to make sure to note that we need some funding for our regulatory body, the DEQ, to help them to use this science to actually regulate these chemicals. They can't use the science from the collaboratory unless they duplicate it. So they need the funds to do that. So just pointing out that little advocacy note. Any other questions, comments?
This is Ed Ablard. I'm here in Wilmington. Dr. DeWitt we made a trip with our 14-month-old Doberman to the animal sciences part of the State University, the North Carolina State University, and I drew a blank with personnel up there about the existence of PFAS in the area up there, serviced by the water out of Jordan Lake. So I'm wondering what kind of penetration tools we could offer to get the word out in that area in the near term rather than waiting another 3 years.
Yeah, I might even call on Maddie to help answer that question. I know one of the things that the National Academies is doing that both LA and Emily mentioned is getting information out to clinicians so that doctors who treat people can be informed about PFAS. But in terms of the veterinary community, I don't know if most vets know about how contaminants like PFAS can affect the pet of their health. Maddie, what has been your experience in working with pet owners? Have you worked with any veterinarians who have information about chemical contaminants in pet health?
So Maddie jumped off. She said she had to go pull some embryos out of the PFAS exposure treatments. She did send me a photo of the embryos. So she's not available, but we can definitely seek some of that information from her offline.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that we have a lot of really great groups here in North Carolina and some other states advocating, at least at the federal and state levels, for some of the standards that need to be implemented and some of the changes to our laws. But I think on the ground, there might not be as much information getting out to individuals and pet owners who really need to know about the effects of these chemicals on their health so that they can start to monitor their health and their pet's health. How do we do that? I think this is one way to start doing that. But how do we get more information out to more people? That's a good point.
Is there anybody else who would like to make a question or comment? I think Emily Sutton is still with us for a couple minutes. Okay. Anybody have questions about the Greensboro area? Emily is it's not the most pretty of titles, but I think she's the landfill leachate queen. So if you have questions about garbage and PFAS, she's your girl.
That is not my favorite title, but it's accurate, so I'll take it. So there's a question in the chat about why wastewater treatment plants are not treating for PFAS. The big thing is it's a huge cost and they don't have to. So right now there's not surface water limitations in any requirements for treating wastewater effluent. So the way that this process works is that they have to know what to test for and able order to get.
Breaking up a little, Emily, maybe block your screen.
Sure, okay. So they're not monitoring for it, and so therefore it's not being treated. So there are treatment options, and we're pushing for the sources that we know are contributing, like Burlington, Greensboro, Reedsville, to begin that treatment process. But until the state requires it in the surface water effluent limitation, they won't be required.
And here's where, again, I plug in the action items. And I know this all seems so daunting and so huge, and we had such information, just an information dump from these amazing speakers. But the key is to stay active. That's the way, for me, that I feel like I can live with these challenges, is by taking action to affect change. It helps your soul when you actually do something about something that worries you. So I would definitely recommend to everyone, make a couple calls. The legislators are listening. We will provide links to help you find your legislators in our email on Wednesday, and some helpful talking points based on some of the comments and presentations provided. And it only takes a few minutes, and we know that they're listening, and they need to know that you're paying attention. So with that, any other questions, comments?
I just have one comment. And I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, Shantae, we can hear you. Thanks.
I'm so thankful for this presentation from everyone. And I feel like as Americans, we're often the savior for other impoverished nations. And we have a crisis on our hands right in our US territories. We find ways to raise money to provide wells for other countries. And I think with the low income people of color and just lower socioeconomic status, we could use our platform to help crowdfund and get reverse osmosis installed in some people's homes, or even for the community that provides water on the, on the city level. They're just things that I think that we can do in maintaining our vision of hope. And I wanted to ask you if, and I'm actually getting ready to recycle if you hear my voice breaking up, but I wanted to ask you if you felt that we lost momentum during this pandemic in our effort to educate people about these chemicals.
Emily, Donovan, you want to take that one?
If we lost momentum, it happened during Hurricane Florence. And that was the big hit that we saw. But we were able to bounce back. So when the pandemic hit, I wasn't nearly as anxious about momentum because we saw it jump back up. So I think it just requires more work. It's a longer haul because you got to just restart. It's like with any race, and this is a marathon. You take a break, it's really hard to get back in it. But no, I hear and I feel exactly what you feel. But I think we just keep relying on each other. You take that emotional break when you need it, and then you jump right back in because there's always someone running with you. You're not alone in this. And so we just keep our coalition strong, and we'll get to the finish line.
Thank you.
And I'll say, in terms of pandemic and outreach, I just did a presentation on how the pandemic actually affected our outreach. And this is a prime example. There were almost 90 people here on this Zoom. We couldn't fit 90 people in our office for the in-person event. So we had this, and we also had Facebook Live happening. So we take the good with the bad. Obviously, the pandemic is disastrous, but we have an opportunity to reach more people virtually. So, that has definitely been a plus. Anybody else, comments or questions?
I wanted to make a comment, actually, just to raise an issue that we've discussed a lot, which is the issue of sustainability. And this is just something I want to point out because some other media has encouraged, for example, short-term action items like toss your Teflon pan. Let me just say, please don't just throw away your Teflon pan. That doesn't really help insofar as limiting your personal exposure. But what it does do is when that Teflon pan goes to a landfill, it contributes to leachate. And so if we're thinking about sustainability with regards to these products that eventually we're going to be done with, one option might be eventually to have a system where the supplier of said product is actually responsible for a sustainable way of breaking that down safely, because currently there are very few opportunities for that. So I just wanted to plug that. Please don't just throw your Teflon pan away.
Okay, we are at 11:07, which is actually somewhere near around when we usually end because we have a lot longer Q&A. But would anybody else like to jump in with questions or comments? I'll give you one more 10 seconds to unmute yourselves. Okay. Well, in the interest of everyone's time and Saturday morning, and so that Jaimie can get some rest, I would love to, again, thank everyone for coming. This has been amazing, and thank you to our amazing speakers, Dr. Jaimie DeWitt, Elijah Yetter-Bowman, Micia Whittington, Emily Donovan, and Emily Sutton. This has been a great presentation, and we will see you all soon.